Jesus looks for fruit, finds none, and Mark immediately says it was not the season for figs. Why judge a tree for obeying the calendar? The answer begins not with botany alone, but with Mark's arrangement of the entire episode around the Jerusalem temple. Mark starts the fig tree story, interrupts it with the temple action, then returns to the tree after it has withered. That nested order is our first useful clue. The tree and temple are designed to be read together. Before interpreting anything, we need the sequence Mark actually gives, without importing Matthew's more compressed order. After entering Jerusalem, Jesus inspects the temple, then leaves the city for Bethany because the hour is late. The next morning, returning from Bethany, he is hungry and notices a fig tree and leaf from a distance. He searches it, finds nothing but leaves, and declares that no one will eat its fruit again. Mark then moves directly into the temple court, where Jesus disrupts buying, selling, exchange tables, and traffic. He teaches from Israel's prophets, while temple authorities begin seeking a way to destroy him publicly. After leaving the city, the group passes the tree next morning and sees it withered from its roots. Peter remembers. Jesus answers with teaching about faith, prayer, and forgiveness. That is Mark's complete frame. Geographically, Bethany lay on the eastern side of the Mount of Olives, a short journey from Jerusalem. Mark's movement is therefore concrete, lodging outside, climbing toward the ridge, then approaching the city. A textless route map helps us see the rhythm. Bethany is behind them. Jerusalem and its temple complex lie ahead. The roadside tree appears during a repeated commute, not an isolated wilderness encounter. Mark 11:11 matters. Jesus has already entered the temple and looked around before the fig tree episode. The next day's action is not portrayed as a sudden discovery made without prior observation. That detail does not explain every motive, but it strengthens a narrative connection. Inspection comes first, the tree sign follows, and the public temple action comes after both. Now to the plant itself. The common fig is a deciduous Mediterranean tree with large leaves, multiple fruiting patterns, and considerable variation by cultivar, climate, pruning, and local conditions. Mature main crop figs normally develop later on new growth. Some trees also bear an earlier crop, often called a breba crop, on wood formed during the previous year. Those broad facts are useful, but they do not produce one certain reconstruction for a specific roadside tree in first-century Judea. Ancient conditions, variety, and exact spring timing remain unknown. Near Passover, full-ripe figs would generally be unexpected. Mark openly acknowledges this by adding that it was not the season for figs, making the apparent mismatch impossible to miss. Some interpreters propose that abundant leaves could still invite inspection for small early fruit, edible buds, or fruit surviving from an earlier cycle. This is possible in some fig-growing discussions, not proven here. Others reply that Mark's explicit seasonal note deliberately removes normal agricultural expectation. On this reading, the oddness is literary. The reader is pushed away from a simple orchard lesson toward symbolic action. A third caution is essential. Leaves do not function as a universal botanical contract guaranteeing edible fruit. Growth order differs, early crops are inconsistent, and regional observations cannot be treated as absolute rules. So the careful historical conclusion is limited. Jesus could see a conspicuously leafy tree. Mature seasonal figs were not expected. Whether another edible stage should have been present remains debated. That uncertainty does not weaken Mark's story. It explains why responsible interpretation must combine agriculture with narrative structure, rather than claiming that one obscure fig fact solves the episode. Look again at the wording. Mark does not merely report an unproductive tree. He highlights distance, leaves, inspection, absence, spoken judgment, overhearing disciples, delay, and complete withering afterward. Those features make the incident resemble a prophetic sign action, a public or memorable act that embodies a warning, much as Israel's prophets sometimes performed messages instead of only announcing them. A sign action is not a secret code in which every leaf equals one institution. It is a dramatic analogy whose meaning is supplied by the surrounding narrative and prophetic language. Here, the surrounding narrative is unmistakable. The moment Jesus speaks against the tree, Mark carries us into the temple, and the moment the temple confrontation ends, Mark carries us back to the tree. Scholars often call this an intercalation, or Markan sandwich. In plain language, story A begins, story B is placed inside it, and story A resumes afterward for interpretation. The structure invites mutual interpretation. The fig tree gives the temple episode an image of inspected fruitlessness and coming judgment. The temple episode tells us what kind of warning the tree most likely represents. This is stronger than saying merely that both events happened near each other. Mark has arranged their beginnings and endings so that the reader must hold them in one mental frame. Inside the temple, Jesus drives out sellers and buyers, overturns money-changing tables and dove sellers' seats, and blocks people from carrying goods through the court, according to Mark 11:15-16. Money exchange and animal provision had practical roles in pilgrimage. Mark's criticism is therefore not that commerce is inherently foreign to worship, but that Jesus judges what the temple space has become. Mark then gives the interpretive center through two prophetic lines. Jesus invokes Isaiah's vision of a house of prayer for all nations, and Jeremiah's charge that the temple has become a robber's den. Isaiah 56 imagines excluded people being gathered to God's holy mountain, with sacrifices accepted and prayer extending beyond one group. Mark explicitly cites that inclusive temple vision there. Jeremiah 7 is more severe. In its original setting, people trust the temple while practicing injustice, as though the building guaranteed safety. The prophet warns that sacred status cannot shield corruption. A robber's den is not primarily the place where robbery occurs, it is the refuge where robbers feel secure afterward. Jeremiah's image attacks false security joined to wrongdoing. Mark does not quote every surrounding verse, and we should not pretend he reproduces Jeremiah's whole sermon. But the explicit citation makes prophetic temple judgment central to the scene. The fig tree now fits that prophetic atmosphere. It has visible foliage, is inspected, and yields no fruit. The temple has visible activity, is inspected, and receives a warning grounded in prophetic expectations. Several Hebrew Bible passages make fruitlessness a natural image for failed faithfulness. Micah 7 opens with a search for summer fruit and early figs, then laments the absence of upright people. Jeremiah 8:13 joins missing grapes and figs with withering leaves in an oracle of judgment. The verbal and visual overlap is suggestive, though Mark does not identify it as a quotation. Hosea 9 recalls Israel as an early fig prized by God, then turns to covenant failure and judgment. Again, this provides scriptural atmosphere, not a one-to-one decoding key. These passages show why a Jewish audience could hear fruit imagery morally and communally. They do not prove that Mark intended every text, and they certainly do not authorize condemning an ethnicity. Jesus and his disciples are Jewish. The temple is Israel's sacred center. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, and Hosea are Israel's prophets. The dispute belongs inside first-century Jewish religious life. That setting matters because later Christian readings have sometimes turned the tree into a curse upon Judaism or the Jewish people. Mark's narrative does not justify that move. At most, the enacted warning targets fruitlessness under judgment, and in this context, many interpreters connect it especially with the temple establishment, its leadership, or its present functioning. Even that formulation needs care. Some scholars see a judgment on the temple institution itself. Others emphasize leadership. Others see a broader warning to Jerusalem, disciples, or anyone whose appearance lacks faithful fruit. The most defensible center is not ethnic replacement. It is prophetic accountability. Sacred appearance, inherited privilege, and busy activity do not exempt a community from justice, prayer, and faithful response. Now consider the tree's delayed withering. In Mark, the disciples hear Jesus' words on one morning, but the visible result is discovered the next morning, after the temple confrontation. That delay creates narrative space for the temple episode to occupy the center. The tree's condition afterward becomes a visual verdict, while the intervening action explains the verdict's target and seriousness. Peter says the tree Jesus addressed has withered. Mark adds that it is withered from the roots, an image of comprehensive collapse rather than a few damaged leaves. Yet Jesus' following teaching shifts toward the disciples. He tells them to trust God, speaks of a mountain cast into the sea, and connects faithful prayer with confidence. The mountain saying may resonate with the visible landscape and Temple Mount, but Mark does not explicitly say, "This mountain means the temple." That proposal remains an inference, not a textual fact. Likewise, the prayer promise is not a prosperity formula or permission to demand anything. It sits within trust in God, the mission of Jesus, and the ethical demand that follows. Mark 11:25 adds forgiveness. When standing to pray, disciples must release grievances so that they too may receive forgiveness. Faith is therefore paired with reconciled conduct, not magical certainty. The sequence produces a double warning. Institutions cannot rely on sacred display without fruit, and disciples cannot celebrate institutional judgment while ignoring faith, prayer, and forgiveness in their own lives. This also explains why the episode is more than Jesus losing patience with a plant. Mark's careful framing, prophetic citations, delayed result, and discipleship teaching all point beyond private irritation. Nor does the story require us to say Jesus made a botanical mistake. Mark himself supplies the seasonal fact, apparently expecting readers to feel the tension rather than conceal it. The question becomes rhetorical and prophetic. What happens when the appointed moment of divine inspection arrives, even though ordinary agricultural expectations would say fruit is not yet due? Some scholars emphasize the Greek word for season or appointed time, kairos, hearing an eschatological edge. Ordinary fig season has not arrived, but the decisive time announced in Jesus' mission has. That reading is plausible because Mark opened Jesus' proclamation with fulfilled time in Mark 1:15. Still, vocabulary alone cannot prove the entire interpretation, so it should remain a debated layer. Another reading treats the tree mainly as an acted parable of appearance without substance. Its strength is the leaves-fruit contrast. Its weakness is that leaves alone may be pressed too mechanically. A more integrated reading combines the images without over-precision. The strangely timed search creates prophetic shock, the sandwich connects it to the temple, and the withering confirms judgment. Now compare Matthew 21:12 to 22. Matthew places the temple actions soon after Jesus enters Jerusalem, then narrates the fig tree on the following morning outside the city there. In Matthew, the tree withers immediately. The disciples react at once, and Jesus teaches about faith and prayer. The two tree scenes are no longer separated by the temple action. That is not a detail to erase by harmonizing the accounts into one blended timeline. Matthew and Mark present related traditions with distinct narrative pacing, sequence, and emphasis. Matthew compresses the miracle and highlights its immediacy. Mark stretches it across 2 mornings and places the temple confrontation inside, making the interpretive relationship especially visible to readers. Therefore, when asking why the temple episode stands between Mark's fig scenes, the answer is literary as well as historical. Mark wants the reader to interpret each event through the other. The arrangement resembles opening a question, inserting the evidence, then returning for the verdict. The tree poses the riddle. The temple supplies the field of meaning. The withering seals the warning. If this careful separation of text, history, and interpretation is useful, subscribe to World Behind the Verse. Now let us test the conclusion against the passage's remaining limits. Mark never states in a single explanatory sentence, "The fig tree equals the temple." The connection is a strong inference from structure, sequence, vocabulary, and prophetic citation, not an explicit equation. Mark also never describes the temple action as a campaign against Jewish worship. Jesus argues from Jewish scripture about what the temple is meant to be before God. The authorities' response adds political weight. Chief priests and scribes seek a way to destroy him because they fear his influence, while the crowd is astonished at his teaching. This conflict is not merely about market tables. It concerns authority to judge the temple's condition, interpret its vocation, and announce consequences in Jerusalem's most charged public space. The Passover setting intensifies everything: pilgrims, sacrifice, exchange, imperial oversight, and hopes surrounding Jerusalem made the temple both sacred center and politically sensitive institution during annual festival days. Yet Mark gives no license for reconstructing exact crowd size, weather, tree variety, or a complete economic conspiracy. Evidence-led reading stops where the surviving text and history stop. We can now rank the claims. Textual fact. Mark says the tree had leaves, no fruit, and that it was not fig season. The temple action is placed between curse and withering. Historical context. Mature figs were normally seasonal. Fig trees could have complex early and main crops, and the temple supported pilgrimage practices involving offerings, animals, exchange, and services. Strong inference within Mark. The intercalation clearly presents the tree as an enacted prophetic sign that interprets the temple warning and is itself interpreted by that warning in return. Debated interpretation. Whether Jesus expected early edible growth, whether Kairos carries special end-time force here, and whether the judgment falls on leadership, institution, city, or a wider audience. Later misuse must be rejected. The passage does not curse Jews, dismiss Judaism, excuse Christian triumphalism, or promise material wealth to anyone who speaks confidently enough at all. So why seek fruit out of season? On the narrative level, the impossible timing makes the action conspicuous. Mark wants readers to ask why ordinary agricultural expectation has been interrupted. On the symbolic level, inspection has arrived before normal fruit season because the story is staging a prophetic moment of accountability, not recording ordinary roadside orchard management at all. And why place the temple between the tree scenes? Because the middle scene identifies the warning's immediate field, a temple called to prayer for all nations, but confronted with Jeremiah's language of false security. The withered tree then interprets the temple action as more than reform of marketplace procedure. It signals severe judgment. The temple action prevents that judgment from becoming a vague lesson about productivity. At the same time, Jesus' teaching on faith, prayer, and forgiveness turns the warning toward disciples. They must not become another leafy community whose visible religion lacks faithful fruit. One uncertainty remains. We cannot recover exactly what stage of growth stood on that roadside tree, or clearly prove which agricultural expectation Mark assumed his earliest listeners shared. But we can explain why Mark preserves the puzzle. The seasonal note sharpens the enacted sign. The sandwich structure directs it toward the temple. The prophets define the moral horizon. The best layered answer is therefore neither botanical error nor irrational anger. It is a deliberately jarring prophetic action, most plausibly tied to temple judgment, followed by instruction for Jesus' followers. Which detail most changes your reading of the passage? Mark's seasonal note, the temple sandwich, or the final command to forgive while standing in prayer? Subscribe to World Behind the Verse for more careful journeys through the history, language, literature, and material world that bring difficult passages of Scripture into focus. The road from the tree to the temple reveals Mark's answer. Visible religion is inspected for faithful fruit. and the warning finally reaches every community that claims to stand before God.